who are coming in for the first time. They have to be let in. But now that we've opened up the waiting room, people are can just come in as they come.
Great.
The breakout rooms are something that we are using between sessions in case people want to continue the conversation, so that it feels more like a regular conference, and so that there can be conversation between sessions. It's a new one for me, but it's going well so far. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to those of you who joined us this morning. Welcome to all of our panelists as well. I would like to start today by introducing myself. My name is Rebecca Tidler. You can see my preferred pronouns are she, her. If you would like to change your own name on the Zoom, you can do so through the participants button. I'll just put the instructions to that when I get a chance in the chat. If you want to add your own pronouns, for example. Please do turn off your camera unless you are one of our honored panelists today, so that we can reduce our emissions for this event. And thank you for coming to celebrate Indigenous expertise and sustainability with us today. I'm going to start with a territorial acknowledgement. I'm just going to share my screen quickly, if that's all right. So we are coming to you today from Tiohtià:ke, which is unceded Indigenous land, the land of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, which is recognized as the custodians in the land of the lands and the waters on which we gather today. We do have two local communities of Kahnawake and Kanesatake, who are close by to Concordia University here. This is our official territorial acknowledgement, which was put together thanks to the wonderful work of some of our valued colleagues here in the Office of Indigenous Directions in 2017. I will put a link in the chat as well, though, so that those of you who are not with us from Tiohtià:ke today can look at where you are joining us from. And also another link for those who would like to see if they are at another institution here in Canada, whose land they are on, or if you have studied or worked at another educational institution here in Canada, you can see where you have studied and worked. For me personally, I am a second-generation immigrant settler here in Tiohtià:ke, and I did trace back the places I have studied, and I have studied on the unceded land of the Lenni Lenape in Lenape, and the Anishinaabe people, and also in Treaty 6 in Alberta, which is home for many Indigenous people, including the Cree or Nihiowik, the Saulteaux, the Niitsitapi, and the Métis, and the Nakota Sioux people. So I'll put some useful links for those who want to look a little bit further into that. With that, I would like to welcome Jen Goby, who is organizing today's panel and will be facilitating. Jen has just completed a postdoc here at Concordia. She is an activist and a scholar. With us here, she has been doing some teaching recently at Bishop's University and as well at McGill. She's the founder of the Mud Girls Natural Building Collective and is also now the director for research at the Frontlines, a new initiative supported by the Climate Justice Organization Hub, which connects grassroots communities and organizers in the front lines of the fight for environmental and climate justice. She is currently also involved in the Indigenous climate action work, which we will hear about today. With that, Jen, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks for having us all here today to have this conversation together. I'm just going to tell you a bit about Indigenous climate action and the project, and then I'll tell you about myself and how I'm involved. So Indigenous climate action is an Indigenous-led organization guided by a diverse group of Indigenous knowledge keepers, water protectors, and land defenders from communities and regions across so-called Canada. ICA believes that Indigenous people's rights and knowledge systems are critical to developing solutions to the climate crisis and achieving climate justice. So yeah, ICA is a Canada-wide organization led by primarily Indigenous women doing fantastic work. And one of the projects they have on the go is called Decolonizing Climate Policy. And this project has been going on for 2 years already. It's a research project that has had 2 phases so far, may go into a 3rd phase. The first phase was a critical policy analysis of federal climate policy from the perspective through the lens of Indigenous rights, Indigenous knowledge, and Indigenous approaches to climate action. So that in that research, we found, so I'm part of the research team, we found that federal climate policy is actually structurally excluding Indigenous people, and that has serious implications and consequences for the kind of policies and what they can achieve. So that was phase 1, and Sarah's gonna share in the chat the ICA's website and our project page, as well as that report. We've also put out a report not too long ago about the risks and threats of nature-based climate solutions to Indigenous folks. And currently we are in phase 2 of the project, which is actually developing Indigenous-led climate policy. So we've been talking to folks across the country from different nations, from different biomes, about what climate policy means to them, what kind of solutions they want to see raised up as policy. So all the panelists here today are involved with this project. Sarah's our youth research intern. Tiffany is on the advisory council, and Deborah's also on the advisory council. So we're going to be talking about the project and talking about the sort of themes around it. I myself am a settler. I currently live on unceded Abenaki territory. I was born and raised on Tiohtià:ke, on Montreal, and on Mohawk territory. I'm a settler who has, through my education and activism, come to strongly feel and think that Indigenous-led climate work is the most transformative force in Canada right now. Indigenous-led defense and Indigenous-led climate solutions. And so I put my time and energy and skills behind in support of those kind of initiatives. So I've been part of the decolonizing climate policy since the beginning. And it's been a real honor, and it's an honor to bring that project to this conference. So with that little intro, I'm going to now introduce our speakers and then ask them a round of questions. So Sarah Hansen, who's the youth research intern, is an Anishinaabe from Bijtikong, Nishnabeg, currently living and working on the traditional lands of Fort William First Nation, currently referred to as Thunder Bay. She holds a biology degree from Queen's University, using the knowledge gained to connect with other climate activists from across the world while simultaneously providing an Indigenous perspective. For the past few years, Sarah has worked on creating spaces for Indigenous youth to connect and learn about climate change, sustainability, and reconciliation. When not working, Sarah loves to bead, sew, learn Anishinaabe, re-explore her traditional lands along the north shore of Lake Superior. Thanks for being here, Sarah. Deborah McGregor, also on our advisory council, is Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation, Birch Island, Ontario. She is a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at York. Dr. McGregor is an expert in the application of Indigenous intellectual and legal traditions in addressing significant challenges of our time, and in Indigenous research and methodologies to ensure research is ethical and benefits Indigenous communities. Dr. McGregor will also be speaking about her work on the rights of, for the environment at 4 p.m. today as part of this conference. Welcome, Deb. And Tiffany Traverse, also advisory council member to the Decolonizing Climate Policy Project, is a non-status Secwepemc farmer, land and seed steward, language learner, and food sovereignty advocate. Her passion for feeding people and the firm belief in the right to healthy, culturally appropriate foods for all drives her work. She is passionate about the uncomfortable work in dismantling structural racism within institutions and conducting experimental plant breeding projects to adapt nutrient-dense cultivars to our changing climate, as a guest in Treaty 8 territory. So Tiffany has served as a volunteer advisory council member with the Community Seed Network, and it currently sits as a member at large on the board of directors for Seed Change, as well as on the Equity and Inclusion Advisory Committee for Farmers for Climate Solutions. Her hope is to continue being a weaver, advocating to create better access to resources and increase our collective seed and food sovereignty and security. So welcome, Tiffany. So I think those are official bios, but I'd like to offer or invite you all to introduce yourselves a bit more, to tell us more about yourself, where you're from, what you do, and what led you to be involved with the work of decolonizing climate policy in so-called Canada. So I will ask Deb to introduce yourself first.
Bonjour, everyone. I would say afternoon, but it may well be that some of you, it's morning where you are. So good day, and hopefully it continues to be so. So thank you for having me and being part of this panel. I'm excited. I'm always learning a lot from the other panelists and their perspective, and Jen for coordinating this, because I have to admit I do need to be coordinated and managed for these kinds of things. In terms of so I'm from Whitefish River. I'm in Anishinaabe. I tend to see the world through that way, through the work that I've done in the academic world, but I also work in the Indigenous world. So you're always grounded, grounded in what I call that world, and I'm always trying to mediate, negotiate my way between these worlds. And I got very much involved in climate justice work because that's what communities wanted. So I tend to respond to whatever it is that communities are asking me to get involved in. And I just applied sort of my equity kind of justice lens to the climate work that I was seeing. And I had this underlying understanding that if you don't count for colonialism in policy or even in lawmaking or whatever is going to influence Indigenous peoples, their lives, their lands, and future generations, if you don't account for that, then there's a real risk of recolonization. And as a general rule, we don't want that. Maybe there are folks who do, but Indigenous peoples don't generally want to be recolonized all over again through other people's policies and processes. And this is the case even after so many decades or even centuries of Indigenous resilience to resistance and resilience to other people's solutions. So what brought me specifically to this project actually was I was asked to facilitate and be part of coordinating a youth elders climate change gathering up actually in the territory that Sarah's in Thunder Bay. And it just became so obvious to me, like it was conceptually and abstract and intellectually there, but not like playing out before my very eyes in terms of what are solutions and what was sort of being proposed by governments as being climate solutions that Indigenous people should be embracing was totally not what people were saying. Elders and youth were saying we need to connect to the land, we need to learn language, we want to be able to hunt and fish. So there shouldn't be mining, those kind of things shouldn't be happening. And the solutions being proposed were almost geared towards getting Indigenous people off the land, still that sort of very colonial way of let's get them all settled into one little spot so they don't interfere with what we want to do out there on the land. And then it finally, you would have thought it would have been more obvious, but it really hit home that other people's solutions have a real risk of harming and recolonizing Indigenous peoples and severing their continued relationship to the lands and what ensures the survival of Indigenous people. So it was really obvious to me there why it hadn't been before that. Yet again, abstract there, but then seeing it kind of play out. I'll stop in another minute. So I find myself in these other circles. I call them the climate change circles, and I find that people in those places, they're all like, the thinkers around climate science and climate assessments and everything else. And they tend to, they don't want to acknowledge colonialism as a factor in the work that they're doing. They don't want to acknowledge colonialism as being part of trying to derive appropriate solutions that are going to impact everyone and the natural world. They don't like to go there. They don't see how it's relevant. So I find myself in this advocacy position in these other circles of always having to advocate to say, you need to think about this, even though you don't see how it's related to your science or to the assessment, it's actually very relevant. So it was so such a relief to work with Indigenous climate action and Jen on this, because I didn't have to explain, like people already knew. And so we could like further the work. And that's a lot different than having to explain who Indigenous people are, that you could actually get to the work. And so there was a lot of energy in that. So So having these other experiences and then getting to work on a project where people understood that already, then you could move it, you could advance things, right? Then always be in this, I got to educate people again, this burden that Indigenous people tend to have in these spaces. So that's how I came to this project, and then moving it towards, instead of just critiquing, to say, okay, what can it look like then? What does it look like if you're not going to recolonize, if you're actually going to ensure that there could be Indigenous-led solutions and that be understood in different spaces. So I'll stop there, and happy to chat more with you about this and hearing from the other panelists. But we got that opportunity.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you so much for that. Sarah, now why don't you tell us more about yourself, where you're from, what you do, and what brought you to this work?
Yeah, definitely. So Bojanine, I think similar to Deb, I came from this space of wanting to like connect and learn. But I, being a youth, I'm definitely a lot newer to it. I've only been in like the climate action, sustainability, or even reconciliation space for like 3 years when you think about it. Full time. I was, of course, always involved being Indigenous. You inherently are. But I think because I was put on this trajectory as a youth, living within like, especially the Indian Act, being a status First Nation, is that I was put on this trajectory of like, okay, you go to education, you go to elementary school, then you go to high school, and then you go to university, and you're always looking towards like the next thing of like what you're supposed to attain. But as an Indigenous youth, I never actually knew what I wanted to do. I always thought I wanted to be a doctor, and I still sometimes think about that. But I think that comes from my want to heal not only myself, but the land and my people, because of the traumas we've been enduring since first contact. So when I think of like who I am and how I relate to this space, I was kind of thinking of like 3 things. And the first is I'm a bridge builder within this space. That's both between like Indigenous youth and non-Indigenous youth, because there's this separation within the climate action, sustainability, climate crisis space of Indigenous work and non-Indigenous work, especially within youth spaces. But this also happens within the wider Indigenous space of like Indigenous governance and how it's been done and how it's been imposed on us through the national Indigenous organizations. And that's more like grassroots youth space, and the youth like me who've been forced on this trajectory to go through education. So I'm working in these like 2 different spaces to bridge these gaps. I'm also reconnecting to my land and self through thinking critically about how my community talks about climate change and extractivism, especially within the forestry and mining sectors, as Deborah was talking about in Thunder Bay and the North Shore of Lake Superior. There's not a lot of talks about climate change because it's such a forestry and mining region. It's something that no one really wants to bring up, but has been happening in smaller spaces, in like more quiet conversations where people can actually just talk about it, because this is a very jargon-filled like space to be in. There's a lot of things that you have to know, like the policies, like nature-based solutions, or what even is policy, because these are 2 different conceptions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous spaces. And the last is capacity building through these kinds of conversations, specifically with Indigenous peoples and youth, and especially within the international space that I have been joining more recently, because of my community not wanting to talk about climate change, I've been looking at other communities worldwide who have actually combated extractivist tendencies. There's a lot of people, Indigenous people in South America and Central America, who've also dealt with the same mining companies who are global oriented, coming into their communities and wanting to extract their land, like like mine has. So I've been using these instances in like the space as an Indigenous youth to learn, because this hasn't been talked about, especially in a way that I understand, and that is connected to like who I am as an Indigenous youth. So that's a bit about me. But yeah, I'll hand it back to you, Jen.
Thanks, Sarah. Tiffany, last but not least, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us more about who you are, what you do, and what brought you to this work?
Yeah, Waiko Kwaitap, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for having me in this space, and I'm so honored to be paneling up with Deborah and Sarah. This is a great group. Yeah, so I'm an Indigenous land and seed steward, doing my work now in Treaty 8 territory, which is the home of the Denizah, sort of this edge of the boreal forest. And what really drew me to the work of ICA and working with this decolonizing climate policy work, being that I'm actually a mountain gal. I saw that when we set up looking at the different biomes across so-called Canada, that really drew me to it. We weren't looking at colonial borders. We were actually looking at more of, these ecosystem borders, and really challenging that narrative where, it's not just looking at British Columbia and Alberta and these colonial named provinces. We're actually looking at bringing in not only experts, but people who have lived and experienced these different environments, so-called environments. And yeah, I just want to echo what Deborah said, about how we could actually come into the space and really get to the work right off the bat. Like we were able to just dive right into, the challenges we were facing, celebrating the success stories, and really uplifting the really good things that have been happening in the community as well. But yeah, it's this difficult place where, we want to ensure that our voices are not only being heard within these policy tables, but actually leading that research work. And I've done a bit of research on my own, and with different federal government agencies, and it's really interesting to be in those spaces and see just how siloed that work is. And when we came together as an advisory council, those silos were all busted down, and we were really getting really into the thick of these real on the ground issues that we are all facing. And it's interesting, I always say that there's no such thing as a pan-Indigenous community across this country, but it was really interesting for me in this work to see just how similar a lot of our barriers were in these very inequitable spaces. So yeah, this is what really drew me to this group, and actually just to really get work done, which was really exciting. So yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you, Tiffany. Okay, so I'm going to launch into the first main question. So as I mentioned earlier, in the phase 1 of our project, we conducted in-depth critical policy analysis on federal climate policy, including the Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth within climate change, as well as the more recent Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy report or plan. So we conducted policy analysis on those, and like I said, we found that Indigenous people actually had been structurally excluded from the decision-making tables where those policies and plans had been crafted. In that report, we argued that this has actually rendered the policies both unjust and ineffective. And beyond that, actually violating Indigenous rights to self-determination and to free, prior, informed consent. So I'm wondering if each of you can share your thoughts on why Indigenous peoples and knowledge and experience needs to be central to the work of building and implementing effective and just climate policy. I think what we'll do is we'll hand it over to Sarah to respond first, and then Tiffany and Deb can respond.
Yeah, I first want to just preface that I actually wasn't involved in the first phase of this report, but I did read it as an Indigenous youth who's been interested in climate policy. I think the biggest thing to mention is that climate policy, especially when you're looking at Canadian climate policy, is very jargon heavy and is a barrier in it of itself. That language barrier is really huge. So when we're thinking of why Indigenous youth need to be involved in this work, it's because we've been at the forefront of challenging current narratives like this around climate change and what's needed, not only recently, but for as long as I know, and probably everyone on the panel alongside me can relay, is for example, we've seen this with the Wet'suwet'en and Fairy Creek Indigenous land defenders out in BC, who many of them are living on the land in tiny homes and giving up, these ideals of what society is forcing on us. But as Indigenous youth are becoming involved in their ancestral ways of living, and also relating that to the education they have been forced to receive in some instances, like myself, we're doing this in a very informed way that's combining two opposing positionalities in a lot of ways, but also including work that our own elders have been doing. And this being able to learn about our ancestral ways is something that it has been achievable over the last like 50 years, even because my grandparents, like my mom, wasn't able to. Another thing and reason why youth need to be in this is because I personally think that Indigenous youth and youth in general are supposed to be the policy leaders making the change, because policy isn't supposed to be fixing what's the current problem, but trying to make the future better. And if policy were in, like, my big policy dream is like, if policy were actually run by youth, and when I say youth, this is around like the 18 to 35 mark, that we would see policies being shaped to ensure climate change doesn't happen and the climate crisis doesn't happen. But that's like my personal, very like big dream within this space, because and the reason why I think this is because when you think of the policy spaces and the decision-making spaces especially, it wasn't created to be run by older people. How it works, it's a very time-intensive and emotionally like exhausting thing, and youth have the energy and the connections to do this. But yeah, that's like my personal perspective. I'll hand it back to you, Jen.
Sure. So then what about Tiffany? Tiffany, do you want to share your thoughts on why Indigenous peoples and their knowledges and experience need to be central to the work of crafting and implementing just and effective climate policy?
Definitely. I could say, quite simply that, Indigenous solutions to what is happening right now are the solutions. And we've heard this over and over again. And Sarah made a really great point. And I always say, if we don't have mentors who are younger than us, then we're doing something wrong. I look at even just my own personal work that I do around seeds, seed rematriation and growing seed and adapting to our changing climate. It's the same thing, I believe, with our people. So I really am a strong advocate that, the youth are the future of, what's going to get us there. And while we can, us, elder or older Indigenous peoples can be sharing the knowledge and passing that on, that's sort of the whole point, is to pass this on to our youth. And, instead of just passing on problems, we should be working together and really, creating these solutions. But it really is our youth that are going to be doing that work. And so I'm just so grateful that Sarah's, here with us, with her voice that's very strong. And I love your dream, Sarah. I think it's such a beautiful dream, and I have that same dream. So I'm hoping that, we who have, sort of lived through just a slight bit more can really uplift the work and the passion that you have and really inspire. And I think that's the other important piece, is that we've been so, as Indigenous people, we've been, dispossessed from our land, our culture, our languages. And, Rebecca, in the discussion we had yesterday, Rebecca Sinclair, she mentioned that, these things aren't necessarily lost. Like, they're still there. They're very much embedded in our language and in getting back to the land. And so those are very important pieces to how we collectively are going to be, moving forward in getting, in really getting these solutions and success stories happening more often. And yeah, really, we've just been so systemically left from these decisions, and, knowing full well that we have the solutions to get us there and to heal. And it's not an us versus them, it's everyone. I mean, we're thinking the big picture. We're thinking everyone, the entire ecosystem. And that includes everyone. It's not like Indigenous against non-Indigenous. We have the solutions to really be helping everyone. And so I think that's why it's so pivotal that we're not just brought in as, say, token, diversity hires or, diversity, people into these spaces, but that we're actually leading this work. I think that our voices need to be first and foremost at these tables. So yeah, I would love to hear what Deborah has to say as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, totally impressive. Hard to follow up on that. I actually love that. Like, instead of passing on problems, why don't we pass on solutions through our own knowledge and language and being on the land. So I think that's I love how you put that. And I also agree in terms of youth, like the dream and to be innovative requires that kind of imagination and dreaming. And that's what we need right now. All of those, what I call the big disaster reports, like the IPCC reports, it's just like really bad news, right? And they all call for transformation. And clearly my generation isn't great at that. I'm kind of like this old lady. So we need a whole bunch of Sarahs, right? We need people who kind of can see what that looks like and make it happen, because they do have the energy. I'm happy to pass on what I know and say, fly, be free, like go, do your thing with, and whatever I can do to support, I will try to do that. But so I just wanted to acknowledge that, because I thought it was priceless. Let's stop passing on problems, and let's just start passing on some solutions, right? I think for me, what jumps out in my mind with the question is, there's been so many commissions, I guess, in relation to Indigenous people, and they pretty well all said the same thing, that other people's solutions for Indigenous people have failed and been grossly inappropriate. Like, that was basically the main finding of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. So Indigenous people's solutions become really important in trying to create the space where those can happen, which this project is doing. So that's not top secret, but for some reason it still fails to, those Indigenous inquiries and commissions fail to make it into the climate change dialogue and discussion. So there's this continual failure to do that, even though so much money is pumped into that. The second is that Indigenous peoples have been here for thousands of years, and we're societies and had knowledge and had laws and had governance and our own ways of passing on knowledge. And so we know something about these lands of so-called Canada. So maybe we can, recognize that and share some of that. And that's way longer. That's like thousands of years compared to, the centuries that others have come in and sort of been disruptive in our lives. So to me, that's really important to acknowledge, and that we are complete societies. So we're not interest groups or stakeholders. We're like nations and societies and should be interacted with in that way, because that's really actually most of our history and most of our knowledge comes from being that. So trying to fit into other people's solutions, we try it, like I'm asked to do that all the time, but you just end up banging your head against the wall a lot of the times, because the structure of it doesn't recognize that reality, what I call that reality. And just to build on that a little bit is, so these efforts, even the analysis of the HEHE policy, or even when I look at the Climate Science 250 plan, is there's this narrative around Indigenous leadership in there, Indigenous led, but I don't think people know what that is. And so an organization like Indigenous Climate Justice or Action, and this initiative tends to be on the outside looking in, because they're not accepting what Indigenous climate leadership actually looks like. And so there's this whole narrative and dialogue, people trying to figure this out. What does this mean? How are we going to fund it? And I'm like, it's already happening, but you're not accepting it as that, because it's not fitting into this framework that all these commissions have pointed out have not served Indigenous people. So we still have that kind of work cut out for us, but that's sort of how I'm experiencing it in a lot of these circles that I'm in. I bring these other things that, like, what does that have to do? Like, why are we talking about that in climate dialogue? And I'm like, because we're going to be right back where we started from if we don't. And in relation to Indigenous knowledge, so just to build on that a bit, the way that Indigenous knowledge tends to be approached in these broader circles is still trying to extract it from Indigenous people. Okay, we think Indigenous knowledge can help, but we don't really actually want to protect or care for the people or their way of life. So they're separating it out, which is not what we did, because we were societies and we were nations and we had diplomatic relations with other nations. And that's how I think Indigenous people should be approached, not let's extract what we want from them, forget about them and their livelihood and keep violating rights and destroying the territory of the people that actually generate this knowledge that people are so interested in. So I find that I've been observing that or experiencing that for a long time, and people don't like to hear that. It's like you can't forget about the people and their relationships to the land. Like that's central to this knowledge that you desperately want to fit into your framework and solve these problems that you clearly cannot do on your own. So I'll stop there. And I just really like that. Just building on the other two, like let's just pass on solutions instead of intergenerational trauma, which wasn't our fault. That's colonialism. But what does an intergenerational resilience look like? Like, how do we start enabling that for future generations and positioning them to succeed and be the leaders that they have the energy and the vision and innovation and creative thinking to make happen? I don't know what the answer is there, because I'm happy to just say I'll support. I don't have that kind of imagination anymore, but I like to see that. I'd like to see that happen through really trying to support that kind of transformative thinking.
Amazing. Thank you to the three of you for those very, very powerful and yeah, really beautiful visions and words. I want to share that in for anyone who's here today listening, that our next report is going to be coming out in a couple of months, and that lays out all the incredible ideas that have been coming out of our research with talking to people across the country. So we've talked to over 130 people now and got their ideas for what Indigenous-led climate policy and solutions look like and can look like. So I encourage you all to follow ICA's website and social media for when that comes out. And in the meantime, I'm wondering if the three of you now could tell us a bit about some of the inspiring Indigenous-led work happening on the ground in territories across so-called Canada that you think exemplify the kind of solutions that policy should be supporting and raising up. I think here I'm going to hand it to Tiffany to go first, and then Sarah and Deb can respond.
Yeah, I think this is, sorry, there's a jackhammer outside. I'm going to try and talk over it. This is a great question, like following up on, what we just talked about, because this is what I was discussing before about how we want to be celebrating these successes and uplifting and really bolstering these projects that are already happening in community successfully. Obviously, there's still many barriers to how these programs and projects are going to be actualized. Working within this this colonial system that we're in. Obviously, there's very real barriers, whether it's funding, capacity, land back. I mean, we literally need to be back on the land. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight a few things that I've been seeing that are getting me really excited and really hopeful for the future. And yeah, I'll give a shout out to the folks at ICA. This is a project on the west coast of so-called BC that's doing some really remarkable programming around IPCAs, which is Indigenous Protected Conservation Areas. And this is just a really, I find this to be such a beautiful concept that instead of, having land being in these, these land trusts that still can be very colonial structures where land is, either gifted from, say, people that own land, or taking land out of the so-called crown and making that a protected area. That whole system of like parks and land trusts, I still find it to fracture the landscape, because you're technically you're protecting this area. Well, does that mean that the people that call that land their traditional lands, usually unceded, so this is stolen land, are they still able to come and practice their traditional food ways? Are they able to hunt? Are they able to gather? Are they able to fish? The answer is usually no. And so we're looking at these different models, and I love the work that ICA is doing with Indigenous Protected Conservation Areas. It's using kind of that idea of a land trust, but making it a lot more inclusive to not fracturing the landscape, but actually really protecting these traditional areas, which will just protect you know, the foodways, which I find to be one of the most important things, and not further fracturing, you know, where we're going to be, you know, hunting, gathering, foraging, collecting medicines, things like that. Some more projects that are happening, like, I mean, back home in Secwepemcúlecw, I know that there's many different community garden programs that are taking off, and that's where you know, they can bring in the youth, you know, teach them how to grow their own food, where their food comes from. You know, I've been offering my help whenever I can back home to do some seed saving work with them as well, and teach them the importance of, you know, saving our seed and having this future food, I call it. So it like, these are, you know, they're a lot more smaller scale projects, but I just think they're so important. I'd also like to highlight, you know, the Guardian program, and I know it can be, we can celebrate it, but I think we also have to acknowledge that it still is technically funded through federal funding. So there is that, what I see is a bit of a weakness, where it's, you know, is it sustainable? I mean, is that funding going to be there in the future? Because the program is so important. Like, this is, you know, people in their communities, out on the land, observing and stewarding the land the way we always were meant to do, but giving them the opportunity to do that, you know, as their job. Like, that's what they're able to do. Because I mean, unfortunately, we still live in this capitalist economy, and you know, people need to keep the lights on, et cetera, et cetera. But I think these are, I think a combination of these different projects and initiatives are what we need to be supporting, and again, having them be, you know, Indigenous driven or Indigenous led is just so important. But yeah, those are a few things that I'm seeing going on, and I'm really excited to see what's to come.
Tiffany, Deb, would you like to share what you see going on the ground that inspires you, that you think exemplifies the kind of climate work that should be raised up by policy?
In addition to what Tiffany talked about, like, to me, what I see is being some areas that really should be supported, and in some way they are, like Tiffany pointed out, like sort of like some of the federal funding around climate monitoring, but they tend to again, they kind of get it, but it's government funding. They go, okay, there should be traditional knowledge, there should be on the land, but it's within these particular constraints, and then it's going to feed into other people's decision making, and not really like the nation's decision making, because they want to make good decisions too, and govern what's going on. But recently I've been really focused on language, and that's always been important. And through these grassroots or elder youth gatherings that I've been familiar with, that I facilitated myself, that always came up, and that does not come up in mainstream climate dialogue at all. They don't see the connection there at all. And I think where there's starting to be the emerging evidence, for lack of a better word, is the research around where Indigenous peoples, I'll say, caretake 20% of the world's landmass, but that's where 80% of the biodiversity is, and that's where Indigenous languages are spoken. So Indigenous languages is really key to knowing how to be well with the earth. So I definitely see healing as part of this. The earth, and that relationship has been I wouldn't say severed, maybe in some cases, but definitely impacted, disrupted. And so there needs to be this kind of healing going on. And one of the ways to do it is the land-based type of work that we see that's starting to happen more often. Like, people talk about this, they know it's a thing and they know it's important, but it needs to be Indigenous led, rooted in the land and the people there. But language is really critical to that. So anytime I see that there's a language retention, revitalization type of efforts, to me, those are really key, because that's where knowledge and language and governance or knowledge and laws is embedded within language. So this is becoming known, but that connection hasn't quite been made to climate solutions yet. It is in an Indigenous context, for sure, it's there, but in other circles, and is it going to get supported? You know, that's still, I don't see that yet, but hopefully that starts to happen. So I see that happening. They know that. So that's why there's those initiatives there. some programming, like official, like through universities and colleges, starting to happen to try to support that. So I see those as positive initiatives. So that's been something that I've been focusing on recently, because I think there'll be a huge interest in it, but it really needs to be led and managed by Indigenous people, or you're going to have that kind of thing happen like with Indigenous knowledge. It's going to start happening with Indigenous language. And you can't really have that without the people, because you still need to have the worldview and ontology. It's not just memorizing a bunch of vocabulary. It's a lot more than that. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Sarah.
Yeah, I'll jump right in. And I think the thing that I wanted to like preface this answer is saying is that Indigenous peoples, and especially Indigenous youth, are not a monolith. So our like experiences and understandings of what Indigenous-led climate policy or solutions are going to be different. And for me, I think I wanted to reflect on like what Deb said about having the knowledge before colonization, but also bring that to like we've had the solutions as well since before colonization, and they may not have been known. Like Rebecca, the DCP researcher right now, said yesterday with Tiffany in another conversation about they may not be known, but they're still within us. So these policies or even these solutions aren't going to be one size fits all. They may be similar between communities, but those experiences and those needs need to be community based. So for many youth who I know and I've been involved with, we face this barrier and this fact that we've been taken away from our culture due to intergenerational trauma and past policies like residential schools and child welfare agencies. And these have impact us currently, especially with the news of residential schools and like being brought up. But the projects that are actually being implemented now focus on revitalization of those traditional practices for climate action. Tiffany also mentioned land back in her last answer for the last question, and I love this mention, and I wanted to bring this out because this is actually a big motivator for change. And this is one of those things that connects a movement, and it's more of a movement building than a singular project, because it does mean something different to each person depending on where they come from in this. So this is also similar to Idle No More about 10 years ago. So these two different movements have been helping Indigenous youth and Indigenous people come together around the central problem of climate change, because it's giving us a tangible yet intangible thing to ask for, just land back. That's like the big thing. So when I'm thinking now of like what I think of successful projects, I actually think of collective approaches to climate change and climate action, because I like we've all said, these are solutions that we already know about, but just need to be shared with others so that they can come along with us on this journey of climate change, because we can't leave anyone behind. That isn't a solution. That isn't even an Indigenous-led solution, because we are trying to think of the community. And this doesn't even involve just Indigenous people. Like we've said, it involves everyone. So successful projects that I've seen, this is a webinar that I was actually a part of, was highlighting it anyways, the Ganawage Collective Impact Youth Group who attended COP26. I see this as a very big success because it was one of the first Indigenous youth community groups who've attended COP publicly, the UNFCCC. This is a big international event where a lot of decision makers are, and you can meet them. It's a very easy space if you take that. This kind of focuses around this like international collaboration. This is why I think it's successful, but it also supports the professional development of youth in a way that they want. And then it's also, like I mentioned, community grounded. Another project similar to this, this was announced yesterday, but I'll be going to the UN Permanent Forum in New York next month with Young Diplomats of Canada. And why I include this here is because not all of the Indigenous youth involved in this are climate activists like me. They're researchers, like people. One of my co-delegates is going to the Vatican along the AFN delegation this week. There's someone who was involved with Idle No More heavily. But because we are all Indigenous, I see this as climate action because we're working collectively to advance a goal that we all want, is to ensure that like the next 7 generations have land to live on and things to do and are able to connect to their ancestral lands. And then like the last one that I wanted to mention that I'm not a part of, so I'm not biased around this, but it's the Assembly of 7 Generations in Ottawa. I see them as the big change maker in what youth groups look like, because they've been heavily focused on their community first in that relationship building. That's one of, from my perspective, their biggest triumphs, is ensuring that it's not the projects that are the focus and the outcomes from that, but that the youth are learning something and that it's really youth led. And also like they've been doing a lot of knowledge sharing over the pandemic as well. So they have an immense amount of resources if you ever want to go and look at their YouTube and learn, because it's, to me, all about connecting these stories and seeing the big picture and being able to understand that even though we're not a monolith, we do share similar histories and perspectives, but we do not all agree 100%. Indigenous peoples, there's a lot of us who are involved in the energy sector still and who do see potential there, but are also working towards changing it from the inside. And that does happen as well in government, because we do need people on all sides of this problem to make the change necessary. So yeah. Back to you, Jen.
Thanks. So I just want to bring in my own little 2 cents here in terms of some of the really powerful work I see going on. I think about Indigenous land defenders who are opposing pipelines, who are opposing mines, who are, as a recent report that came out from ICA and Indigenous Environmental Network showed, are keeping a huge amount of carbon in the ground through their land defense. People who, with their fierce love of their lands and their communities and their cultures, are standing up against the extraction industry, against the government, and doing amazing work and actually keeping carbon in the ground in the way government policy has failed to do. And meanwhile, these same folks are being, instead of being celebrated and made heroes in the climate sector, are actually being criminalized by the federal government. Along the same people who are trying to put up climate policy are also criminalizing and putting into jail and treating with violence the people who are defending their territories from extractivism and keeping carbon in the ground. So I just wanted to bring that up as well, because I think that's so amazing work going on the ground too. For our 4th question, so we don't have much time, but I really want to ask this, and we'll ask it to Deb first and see if there's time for Sarah and Tiffany to respond. But there are remarkable differences between Indigenous people's relationships with the land, water, and non-human relatives, as compared to settler relations with the so-called environment. Can you speak about these different relations and what they mean for addressing climate change?
I'll try to be quick so we can hear from the others, because to me, my most recent interest, I guess, in writing is turning to our stories. And in those stories, it points to the non-human world, our relatives, non-human persons, not like no one says environment in the stories. And because that's very defined, like federally, you could go to any federal legislation, it's in there, but that's not how Indigenous peoples understand their relationships to the natural world. But a lot of the solutions come from there as well. And I remember initially when I heard about nature-based solutions, I thought, oh, maybe that kind of gets it, but no, doesn't at all. We're not talking the same thing at all. So sometimes I talk about it more as earth-based solutions where you can learn from, animals and other relatives still realizing their responsibilities that we've forgotten. So a lot of it has to do with understanding our responsibilities. What do we do and what happens when we're not behaving properly in relation to the natural world? Usually there's a destruction or a destruction coming, and often it's animals and the non-human who bail us out in these stories. So renewing those relationships is really important. Kyle Wright writes about this. He says, Indigenous peoples want to renew the relationship with our kin, which is, the broader natural world. That's also doesn't show up in a lot of climate solutions, mainstream climate solutions. They construct it very differently in terms of nature environment is like way over there. But really in Indigenous context, it's actually like really part of our identity. Like when I think about my clan, my responsibilities, what I need to know about the natural world in order to live those kind of responsibilities, as opposed to environment, which is like resources or property or ecological service, is one that people find a little bit more palatable, but it's still not capturing an Indigenous understanding. So to me, I think those, I'll end with this is, because people can look it up, is when we did that Elders Youth Gathering, there was a 5-minute video that came out. There's a young woman, Jade Willoughby, from Northern Ontario, and she described climate change. So we're actually defining what climate change is differently too. Like it is what, IPC says, but we see it much broader than that. Like there's a lot more truth to that story that we need to be able to tell. And she said, climate change is the earth, like things are happening to the earth and the earth's trying to tell us. Like these big disasters are actually the earth trying to tell us something. It's the earth telling a story that we need the capacity to be able to understand. And we don't. Instead, it separates. People get more scared, and they're actually become more separated away from nature because because of this separation, this worldview that looks at it as being a separation as opposed to who we are. And I just remember that. I just thought is brilliant, and she's right. That's exactly what it is. It's they're trying to tell us this is what's happening, and we need a course correction. And it's telling us how to do that through the non-human world. And we need to be able to listen to that and take that seriously. So I'll stop there so that we can hear from the others before the end of the session. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm going to keep it short because this is something that I constantly reflect on in an area that I'm not, I'm having to relearn because of the challenges I face personally in my life. But what I do want to share is this Instagram post, and it's a quote and a picture from a book, and it reads, "The single biggest thing I learned was from an Indigenous elder of Cherokee descent, Stan Rushworth, who reminded me of the difference between a Western settler mindset of I have rights and an Indigenous mindset of I have obligations. Instead of thinking that I am born with rights, I choose to think that I am born with obligations to serve past, present, and future generations and the planet herself." And I think I'm not going to actually provide context to this. I want people to think about this because this to me is why there's that difference. And it's not for me to tell each person individually what those obligations are, but I know mine from my community and from my upbringing on the land. But yeah, Tiffany, to you.
I love that quote. Thank you for that, Sarah. Yeah, and obviously I'll keep mine super duper short. And I really think, with this question, it really is, colonization and individualism that has created people's separation from their relationship to the land, because all of us as humans have connection to land, because people are not maybe on their traditional lands, doesn't mean that they don't have that connection or did not have that connection. But I definitely think it's this, like the capitalistic economy and individualism has created that separation from community and land. Whereas we as Indigenous people, it's deeply embedded in our blood and in our just in our beings. And of course, now we're trying to reconnect to that. And it's trying to educate. And as I said, it's a constant education piece that we're trying to, bring others, allies, settler allies into this space, and understanding that, we have these obligations, right? Like we have these responsibilities, these first instructions, which again, as Deborah mentioned, is so interconnected with our language. Don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure there's probably not a word in many Indigenous languages for crises. So it's like all these things, it's tough. Like I'm just learning my own Secwepemc, but maybe there is a word for crisis now. yeah, I think it's that individualism, the me, and looking out for myself and not thinking about, us as a whole, being able to heal from what's going on right now. That is that separation. So yeah, I'll have to add to that.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you, Sarah, Tiffany, and Deborah. That was a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it. And I've learned a lot. Really thinking about moving beyond other people's solutions and this jargon-filled space, passing on solutions, land back as a motivator for real change, getting to the work, connecting the stories, and listening to what the earth is telling us and what the story she's trying to teach us is. Thank you so much. And Rebecca, if you have final words. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Jen, and thank you for all of you for all of these wonderful insights. I'm yeah, a lot to process, a lot to think about, and really really thank you for the wisdom. I will invite our audience to come back later this afternoon. Deborah McGregor will be participating in another panel. We're lucky enough to have her twice for a panel on representation and rights of the environment. We also on Friday, Sarah, you mentioned the youth group that went to the COP26. So we have them coming, or some of them coming on Friday at noon. So I'll put the link to the conference website in the chat, but all of that is there. So we invite you, to our audience, to stick around, to come back as you can. And a huge thank you really to Sarah, to Tiffany, to Deborah, and to Jen for sharing with us today. We do have breakout rooms open. We are running this as a meeting exceptionally instead of webinars. So if our audience members want to stick around and chat in some of the breakout rooms, we'll open those up. You should be able to move yourself, but if you'd like us to move you, sometimes it doesn't work with older versions of Zoom, we would be happy to. Our panelists here also welcome to stick around, but I understand that you will have commitments as well. So thank you once again for participating today. It was a real treat. Take care, everyone. We'll be starting
Have a
again
good
in
day.
45 minutes with our next panel.
All right, folks, I'll just reiterate what Rebecca mentioned, is that the breakout rooms are open if you want to continue the conversation more casually behind the scenes here. As we are keeping the live stream going, we set up these rooms so you could go in there, pop in and out of them, have a chat with your colleagues that you might see in the Zoom space here in a more casual way. So feel free to pop in there, and otherwise we'll get going again here at 1:45. Thank you.